President Volodymyr Zelensky recently changed his stance on peace talks with Russia. According to Politico, the Ukrainian president agreed that peace talks can begin with Russian President Vladimir Putin still in power. This following a visit with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Several candidates in the 2022 midterms campaigned on Ukraine. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who won her re-election bid, promised, quote, "Under Republicans, not another penny will go to Ukraine."
According to Alexei Goncharenko, a member of the European Solidarity Party in Ukraine, Ukrainians are welcoming the early results of the midterm elections, happy with the defeat of some of the more right-leaning isolationist candidates by candidates who have supported U.S. assistance to Ukraine. Joining us now to discuss how the midterm results could impact U.S. policy on the Ukraine-Russia conflict is Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Dr. Trita Parsi. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep, thanks for joining us. So some people were expecting a bigger victory in the House among Republicans, many of whom had promised to rethink our kind of endless commitment to sending money to Ukraine. That victory was not that vast, although it still does look like Republicans will take the House. What do you make of the enthusiasm for more pro-Democratic Party outcome here among Ukrainians? And then should we be excited about the prospect of actually pushing for maybe negotiations between Zelensky and Putin?
Well, first of all, I don't think anyone went to the polls voting on foreign policy this time around about other issues. So the outcome of the elections is not a barometer of where the American public is on the war in Ukraine, what the U.S. should or shouldn't do. Polls have shown quite clearly that the public wants to see more diplomacy. There is definitely support for Ukraine, but it's not endless and it's not without questions. What I think we're seeing right now is that the White House actually has been pursuing the very same things that the progressives in that by now infamous or perhaps visionary CPC letter called for, which is to actually see more diplomacy, get towards some form of realistic framework to put an end to this war, and also having direct Russia-US contacts. And it turns out that the White House is actually pursuing exactly what the CPC was asking for, and that I think makes some of those who were so critical of the letter look rather strange.
Yeah, Dr. Parsi, what is going on there? We've covered this extensively. The blow-up over the letter was bizarre. Do you think this kind of new news that negotiations are in progress is because of some of the backlash to the letter? Do you think the backlash to the letter was because these talks were already planned, but for some reason they didn't want that to be open knowledge? What do you see the relationship being there?
Well, I think the fact that the letter came out is a key reason as to why the White House came clean about the fact that it's actually engaging in diplomacy. It became clear to the White House, I believe, that their pursuit of diplomacy was a good thing and that the public would actually welcome it. And in fact, if they weren't coming out with it, they may actually be paying a cost because people were starting to get frustrated at what appeared to be a lack of diplomacy. I think the reaction of the letter is because there's some folks out there who are some sort of self-appointed thought police who believe that they're supposed to go out there and squash any debate that may go in a direction that they think is opposite to what the White House wants. The problem is they have no clue what the White House wants because clearly the White House wanted diplomacy, was engaged in diplomacy, and probably, frankly, welcomed the idea of a letter and the opening of a political space that the letter did provide, despite of the way that it played out, because that's what they needed. I've been involved in some things. I've studied diplomacy quite a lot. There are many instances in which you actually do need to have secret negotiations. This one does not qualify. So my thought is that the only reason why the White House was not open about the diplomacy that was taking place was precisely out of the fear of the backlash, not from the American public, but from these pundits and the broader blob who has taken this extreme anti-diplomacy position that is now clearly the opposite position of what the White House is pursuing.
Yeah, they feared backlash perhaps from actor Sean Penn, who met with President Zelensky and offered him a unique gift. Let's watch that.
This is for you.
Oh, Sean.
Yes.
No.
Please.
That is yours.
No, I feel terrible outside. It's just a symbolic, silly thing.
Yes, but
if I know this is here with you, then I'll feel better and stronger for the fight.
So great honor, but until we will.
When you win, bring it back to Malibu.
Great.
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Because I'll feel much better knowing there's a piece of me here.
We have to be. Some moment which is very important. It's not from me. It's from Ukraine. And it's more than one. From me. Yeah, please.
The President of Ukraine for outstanding work. Thank you.
With that level of like over the top support for continuing the war effort until I suppose a preposterous thing that won't happen, the utter defeat of Russia and the overthrow of Vladimir Putin, you can see why there's cultural pressure, I think, exactly like what you were saying, for continuing with the no negotiation, the hard line kind of position.
Yeah, and if we take a look now back about 2 or 3 months, we now see that there's been strategic leaks from the White House trying to open up this space. The revelation that Biden was very annoyed with Zelensky because Zelensky was asking for more, even when the Biden administration was providing a tremendous amount of support, and that Biden apparently lost his temper with Zelensky on that call. There's a reason why these things are coming out right now is precisely because the Biden administration wants to go in a more diplomatic direction, and they need to put some pressure on all sides in order to get them to drop unrealistic preconditions for diplomacy. Both sides are going to come to some form of a conversation at some point with maximalist positions. That's inevitable. What you need to avoid is the preconditions that make diplomacy impossible. And we have now seen, and the White House itself has revealed, that they have put some pressure on the Ukrainians to drop their unrealistic demands, their preconditions that would ensure that there's no diplomacy. I assume similar things have been done with the Russians as well, because the signals coming out of Russia are also a bit different.
Dr. Parsi, this is what is so very confusing to me, though. If it is true that Biden isn't the one, that the Biden administration rather isn't the one that's putting all the downward pressure on the letter, and there are so many people, colleagues of yours in kind of the left, progressive foreign policy space, anti-war foreign policy space, like Matt Duss, Bernie Sanders' former policy advisor, like Joe Cirincione, who were so antagonistic to the letter. Matt Duss flip-flopped, said he was for the letter until the backlash started and then was against it. What was motivating that, if not an effort to protect the Biden administration?
Well, first, I want to avoid getting into any personal things. I've seen that some of them have. I don't think it's constructive. So let me just say what my take is on why some people who were not in the know were acting this way. I think they personally thought that this is what they need to do to protect the president. And, that's an instinct that folks have at various times. But to act on it with the arrogance of actually not knowing what's going on and assuming that you do, and taking a very hostile position that some did, and I want to name any names, towards diplomacy and the very unconstructive approach to it. This is ultimately really, really negative for the country as a whole, because ultimately the United States does need diplomacy. We need direct talks with the Russians because we have a clear interest in avoiding nuclear war. And when even President Obama has come out and said that the level of the negotiations and communications with the Russians is lower than it ever has been since the Cold War, that is a clear warning sign that, look, there's some changes here that need to be done. And it's very unfortunate that some voices, not all, but some voices have acted of trying to just cement the current situation, thinking that that is how they protect the president, whereas in reality, they were completely out of sync with the president.
What should we hope for or expect when negotiations do take place? What does Ukraine need to get from Russia to be, kind of okay with its situation? Obviously, we talk a lot about, Vladimir Putin and might need some kind of safe face saving. The part of he might need to acquire or have independent part of the eastern part of Ukraine. But what are the Ukrainians going to be comfortable with, so they don't feel like they're about to be invaded again when the dust settles and the Russian military gets rebuilt? If Russia really doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, okay, but is there going to have to be some kind of security or protective agreement from the U.S. or other European nations?
So some of these things will come out of the dynamics of diplomacy. It's impossible to completely predict that ahead of time. And I think this is part of the misunderstanding that appears to exist in some quarters about diplomacy. Diplomacy is not going there with a finished proposal and just put it on the table and say, leave it or take it, take it or leave it. There are dynamics in that will come out that may, bring us to a point that is not the one that either side necessarily predicted would happen or had any particular preference for or against. The issue is that some of these things we don't actually know until real conversations begin. And that's why it's so dangerous if talks are not taking place, because so much about diplomacy is actually to collect intelligence on where the other side is on various issues. Are they cracking on some things? How do they see their situation? How can you influence how they see their situation? Not all of it is just about where the line or the border is going to be drawn. So much more goes into diplomacy, and not having enough of it is to the detriment of all of us, particularly the United States, because we have a clear interest in making sure that this conflict comes to an end in the right way, of course, but it nevertheless has to come to an end.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Parsi.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.